1989 until he retired in 2004. He had recently finished the manuscript of his latest book, The Chambers of the Soul, Frederick Douglass, Herman Melville, and the Blues. Through meticulous research, Professor Stuckey sought to discredit the white academics who had dominated and, in his view, devalued the field of African studies. Early on, he was bitterly critical of numerous white experts on Black Africa, as he described them, who have elaborated a fabric of untruths to rationalize continued white control over African studies. Beginning with his breakthrough essay, Through the Prism of Folklore, The Black Ethos in Slavery, published in '68 by the Massachusetts Review, Professor Stuckey maintained that political and cultural studies of Africa must encompass people in North America and the West Indies. He wrote that enslaved workers imported to those places from diverse tribes with slavery as a unifying force perpetuated and adapted their traditional music, dance, poetry, and art to resist the efforts of slave owners to destroy or demean that heritage, and that those traditions went on to imbue modern American culture that we have to pay so much money now for, like John Henry Clark, selling our culture back to us. New York Times says, Sam Roberts is the obituary writer, he says, that overlooked cultural history was evolving, Sterling Stuckey said, while in colleges as well as in the cotton fields, what he calls the besmirching of the African past became pivotal to the process, not only of enslaving blacks, but of destroying their spiritual and psychological moorings. His article stood out as the harbinger of the new slavery studies that would be taken up in the next decade, said Professor Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, chairwoman of Harvard's History Department and president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. She said in a statement after Professor Stuckey's death. In 1970, when his essay, Through the Prism of Folklore, was included in an anthology of essays, Julius Lester, an author and professor, wrote in the New York Times book review that Sterling Stuckey had methodically made the case that in the long years of slavery, the black spiritual, among other cultural tools, like the ring shout dance, the ring shout is in all of his books. He always deals with the circle, and the circle is in all his work, Sterling Stuckey's work. Cultural tools like the ring shout dance was a major weapon of resistance to that dehumanizing institution, and the principal means through which the slaves fashioned and maintained an identity separate from that which the slave owners fought to impose upon them. Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr., director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard, said in an email that Sterling Stuckey helped us to see that the enslaved Africans who came to the New World did not sail alone. They brought their various cultures and belief systems along with them. Out of these rich resources, Stuckey said, they, in contact with dozens of other African and European cultures for the first time, improvised the world's first truly Pan-African culture, an African-American culture, as it were, in the New World, similar in form to that of its several antecedents, but different, unique. And that is the culture to which all Americans are heir today. Sterling Stuckey's Black nationalist ideology, which I'll be discussing, gelled as a student at Northwestern University. He met Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois, picketed a Woolworth store in Chicago to protest segregation in the South, and supported a voter registration project in Tennessee sponsored by the Interracial Congress of Racial Equality. He often praised champions of Black nationalism. Each proposed to build on this nationalism as a means to end prejudice, though none saw it as an ultimate goal, he wrote. Du Bois and Robeson. Stuckey added the caveat that one by no means must be a separatist to be a Black nationalist. Garvey has a different philosophy, but he's still a Black nationalist. Eric Foner, a Pulitzer Prize-winning history professor at Columbia, said in an email that Sterling Stuckey, along with several other historians, was a pioneer of the study of slave culture and how slave culture became the springboard for slave resistance and later for Black nationalism. Professor Stuckey's books included Slave Culture, Nationalist Theory, and the Foundations of Black America, 1987, and Going Through the Storm, The Influence of African American Art in History, 1994. His full name is Pless Sterling Stuckey. He was born March 2nd, 1932 in Memphis. His mother, Elma Erlene Johnson Stuckey, had been a teacher in the South and a hat checker and a maid in Chicago before becoming a supervisor for the Illinois Labor Department. After retiring, she published her first poetry collection when she was 69. His father had been a waiter at the historic Peabody Hotel in Memphis before moving the family to Chicago when the couple's son was 13. Professor Stuckey worked part-time as a high school teacher and postal clerk while earning his bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees from Northwestern. Sterling Stuckey joined Northwestern's faculty in 71 and became a full professor in 77. He left for the University of California, Riverside in 1989. Northwestern is in Chicago, which is where he moved from Memphis when he was 13. In 89, no, that's a big deal. I'll get to that. It's just clicking the significance of going from Chicago to Riverside, California. Most recently, he was Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History at UC California, Riverside. In addition to his wife, who was Harriet Coggs, before they married, she is survived by a daughter, Lisa Dembling, a son, Cabral Wiley Stuckey, a granddaughter, and a great-granddaughter. Professor Stuckey once said in an interview that while growing up, he was most inspired by two books, Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folk and Folk Songs of North America by Alan Lomax. Transplanted, and then I'm going to read, he writes the dialect in some of his work, and I'm going to read because he has a Jamaican poem by a Jamaican artist, my parents are Jamaican, named Louise Bennett. And when I saw him put that in the introduction, I'm like, and she's really speaking to the power that Robeson had on the people in Jamaica. Like, it was an incredible power. He inspired them. He also inspired a lot of Trinidadian intellectuals who I'm working with now. Ackland Lynch, C.L.R. James, Paul Robeson did. And Stuckey kind of articulates this. He definitely articulates this. Transplanted blacks suffered under slavery were united by a centripetal force, Sterling Stuckey said, which inspired Pan-Africanism, spirituals, and the blues, the last paragraph. Though slave culture was treated for centuries as inferior, slave culture was the lasting contribution of slaves to create an artistic yield that matched their enormous gift of labor in tobacco and in cotton. Professor Stuckey wrote in his preface to the 25th anniversary edition of Slave Culture, we must add that the intellectual as well as the cultural and economic history of the African American is rooted in slavery. And so it comes from, it's a rich culture. And there are a lot of arguments that I see online. I know Chris is familiar with some of them that say it's wrong to talk about slavery being the beginning. And Sterling Stuckey never said slavery is the beginning. He just said that it's a incredible forging force that we can't forget. And it's, when you really read it carefully, it is the source of any revolution. Any successful, what Malcolm X called Black Revolution.
Is that your open?
Yeah, it is. Hi, welcome. So, what Sterling Stuckey's work does is remove the stigma of slavery. You know, because people say, oh, it doesn't begin. Well, no, it doesn't begin. But slavery was an important forging force. In his dissertation and in his first book that he published, he talks about individuals who were, in his mind, nationalists, right? And this is important in the West when people who have sought to overthrow slavery have succeeded or have failed. But even the ones who have failed, we take and we learn from. And Sterling Stuckey was very clear. If I can put in one elevator sentence, the elevator sentence, why Sterling Stuckey is important is that he, in as few words as possible, he wrote about consciousness for black people. Mm-hmm. He literally took nobody else but Sterling Stuckey used that word in his dissertation and in his book. And I want to begin, so I'm going to explain where in the first book. But just to give you an outline of what I want to talk about, and these are texts that I think you should have in your library if you don't already. I just remembered in his footnote, he talked about, in the footnote of his dissertation, yes, the footnote of the dissertation, he talks about Paul Robeson's library and how different universities got different books. Oh, he was talking about the Sun, and the Sun was trying to get all of his London library, but couldn't for one reason or another. And different books with a different place. And when I was reading, I was like, oh, I wonder, what if we were able to keep that library? So I said that because I said library. These are books by Sterling Stuckey that you should have in your library. So I'm going to discuss the themes of his 1973 doctoral dissertation, The Spell of Africa.